At 10:15 a.m. on the morning of June 16, 1963, U.S. Ambassador Walworth Barber sat in his office in Tel Aviv, holding a letter that could end America's alliance with Israel. The letter was from President John F. Kennedy, addressed to Israeli Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion. It wasn't diplomatic. It wasn't friendly. It was an ultimatum. The subject was Dimona, a nuclear facility in Israel's Negev desert, a facility Ben-Gurion claimed was for peaceful research, a facility Kennedy knew was designed to build atomic bombs. The letter stated that if inspections didn't take place according to Kennedy's conditions, Washington's commitment to and support of Israel could be seriously jeopardized. Barber prepared to deliver the message. But before he could leave his office, news broke across Israel. Ben-Gurion had resigned. He cited unspecified personal reasons, though intelligence officials believed otherwise. The letter Kennedy had written would never reach Ben-Gurion. The most intense confrontation between an American president and an Israeli prime minister had just been diffused by a strategically timed resignation. If you want to understand how Israel acquired nuclear weapons despite the determined opposition of an American president, please hit that like button. It helps us share more forgotten stories like this, and please subscribe if you haven't already. Back to Kennedy and Dimona. The story begins not in 1963, but on January 19, 1961, the day before John F. Kennedy's inauguration. Kennedy visited the White House as president-elect for a final meeting with outgoing President Eisenhower. After 45 minutes of one-on-one conversation with Eisenhower, the two men walked to the cabinet room to join their departing and incoming Secretaries of State, Defense, and Treasury to discuss the transition. Kennedy asked which countries were most determined to acquire nuclear weapons. Secretary of State Christian Herter fired back, Israel and India, adding that the newly discovered Dimona reactor, being constructed with aid from France, could be capable of generating 90 kilograms of weapons-grade plutonium by 1963, enough for 10 to 15 nuclear bombs. Herter urged the new president to press hard on inspection in the case of Israel before it introduced nuclear weapons into the Middle East. Kennedy had Cuba to worry about, Laos, Berlin, Vietnam. But from his first days in office, he made Dimona a priority. Within days of his inauguration, Kennedy began urging Ben-Gurion to accept a U.S. visit to Dimona, insisting that meeting the request was a condition for normalizing U.S.-Israeli relations. Ben-Gurion stalled. He claimed Israel was experiencing a domestic political crisis. Ben-Gurion announced his resignation and his intention to take a 4-week vacation while still being head of a caretaker government. This was January 1961. The first time Ben-Gurion would use resignation as a delaying tactic. Kennedy had tirelessly pressured Ben-Gurion to allow the visit since taking office. In a sense, Kennedy turned the question into a de facto ultimatum to Israel. By April 1961, after forming a new government, Israel finally agreed. On May 20, 1961, 2 American scientists visited Dimona. But this wasn't a real inspection, it was theater. The visit took place on the Jewish Sabbath, with only select Israeli staff around while inspectors were on site. Before the arrival of any visiting U.S. team, Dimona personnel invested weeks of effort to make the deception believable. What the Americans didn't know was that Dimona had a secret within a secret. The large 6-story underground reprocessing facility, often referred to as a chemical separation plant, would provide capability to produce weapons-grade plutonium and remain concealed. Israel built a fake control room. They bricked up sections of the building. They disguised the plutonium processing plant. As Ambassador Thomas Graham and Keith Hansen describe it, the Israelis successfully pulled the wool over the eyes of U.S. inspectors and concealed the true purpose of Dimona. But here's the disturbing part. According to an oral history interview with Meyer Feldman, Kennedy's White House advisor involved in organizing the visit, the U.S. scientists were hand-picked after considering who might be acceptable to Israel. Think about that. The United States chose inspectors Israel would accept. Feldman explicitly stated that the reason behind the visits to Dimona was to give the color of virtue to it. The inspection wasn't meant to discover the truth. It was meant to provide political cover. Kennedy wanted to reassure Arab leaders, particularly Egyptian President Nasser, that Israel wasn't building nuclear weapons. The inspection gave Kennedy talking points. It gave him plausible deniability. But Kennedy wasn't stupid. U.S. intelligence knew what was happening. Unclassified U.S. intelligence reports appear to ignore the findings of the visit in assessing Israeli nuclear potential. The first inspection in May 1961 produced a sanitized report. The scientists stated Dimona was a research reactor for peaceful purposes. Kennedy used this report to reassure Nasser. But behind closed doors, the CIA told Kennedy something different. In September 1962, Kennedy pushed for a second inspection. After weeks of diplomatic pressure by the Kennedy administration, two AEC scientists who had inspected the U.S.-supplied Sorek reactor were spontaneously invited for a 45-minute tour to Dimona, while on their way back from an excursion to the Dead Sea. 45 minutes at a nuclear complex with multiple buildings, underground facilities, and sophisticated equipment. They had no time to see the complete installation, but they left the site with the impression that Dimona was a research reactor, not a production reactor. CIA and State Department officials were skeptical about the circumstances, unable to determine whether the spontaneous invitation was a treat or a trick. By early 1963, Kennedy's patience was exhausted. The nuclear test ban treaty negotiations were underway. Kennedy was trying to prevent nuclear proliferation globally. And here was Israel, a nation receiving massive American financial support, refusing genuine inspections while building atomic bombs. On May 30, 1961, Kennedy had met Ben-Gurion in Manhattan, not at the White House, a deliberate snub. The meeting was dominated by Dimona. Kennedy wanted answers. Ben-Gurion provided assurances. Kennedy didn't believe him. Now, in 1963, Kennedy decided to escalate. On April 2, 1963, Ambassador Barber met Prime Minister Ben-Gurion and presented the American request for his assent to semi-annual visits to Dimona, perhaps in May and November, with full access to all parts and instruments in the facility. Ben-Gurion resisted. On April 26, 1963, he responded with a 7-page letter. Claiming that Israel faced an unprecedented threat, Ben-Gurion invoked the specter of another Holocaust and insisted that Israel's security should be protected by joint external security guarantees. Kennedy did not allow Ben-Gurion to change the conversation into a discussion of another Holocaust. Kennedy's new letter to Ben-Gurion, dated May 17th, categorically separated the two issues, i.e., the question of Israel's existential security and the matter of Dimona. Kennedy made his position clear. Security guarantees were negotiable. Nuclear weapons were not. Israel would accept inspections or face consequences. On May 27th, Ben-Gurion wrote back. He continued to insist Dimona was for peaceful purposes. He continued to delay. He suggested future visits, but without committing to Kennedy's timeline. Kennedy had enough. On June 15, 1963, he drafted the strongest letter any American president had ever sent to an Israeli leader. The letter included detailed technical conditions under which Kennedy insisted that the biannual U.S. visits were to be conducted. The letter was akin to an ultimatum. If the U.S. government could not obtain reliable information on the state of the Dimona project, Washington's commitment to and support of Israel could be seriously jeopardized. Kennedy demanded semi-annual inspections. He demanded full access to all areas of Dimona, including fuel fabrication facilities and plutonium separation plants. He demanded sufficient time for thorough examination, and he made clear, comply or lose American support. The peak of that confrontation was Kennedy's June 15th letter that Ambassador Barber was supposed to deliver to Ben-Gurion the next day. But on June 16th, before the letter could be delivered, Ben-Gurion resigned. Many of Ben-Gurion's aides dismissed the idea that the nuclear cause alone caused Ben-Gurion to leave office. They point to other pressures, among them the Lavon affair and Ben-Gurion's deteriorating health. But Pinchas Sapir and Yuval Ne'eman, who also served as aides to Ben-Gurion, claimed that Kennedy's pressure was the single impetus for resignation. Ne'eman views Ben-Gurion's resignation as yet another stalling tactic which would allow Israel to finish the project. And that's exactly what happened. Levi Eshkol became prime minister. Kennedy sent him an identical letter on July 5, 1963. Not since President Dwight Eisenhower's message to Ben-Gurion during the Suez Crisis in November 1956 had an American president been so blunt with an Israeli prime minister. Many of Eshkol's advisors saw the letter as a real ultimatum, a crisis in the making. Surprised by Kennedy's tough demands on Dimona just days after taking office, Eshkol's first response was to ask for more time for consultations. According to Yuval Ne'eman, Eshkol and his associates saw Kennedy as presenting Israel with a real ultimatum. According to Ne'eman, the former Israel Air Force commander Maj General Rezis, Dan Tolkowski seriously entertained the fear that Kennedy might send U.S. airborne troops to Dimona. This was not paranoia. Kennedy was furious, and he had the power to cut off all American aid to Israel: financial aid, military aid, diplomatic support, everything. Only on August 19th, more than 6 weeks after he received the letter, did Eshkol come up with a response, which at times was vague. He agreed in principle to inspections, but he continued to stall on specifics, and then, on November 22, 1963, Kennedy was assassinated. Lyndon Johnson became president, and everything changed. While Kennedy's successor remained committed to the cause of nuclear nonproliferation and supported American inspection visits at Dimona, he was much less concerned about holding the Israelis to Kennedy's terms. In retrospect, this change of attitude may have saved the Israeli nuclear program. Johnson wasn't indifferent to Dimona, but he wasn't Kennedy. Between 1961 and 1969, the United States conducted 8 inspection visits at Dimona. 7 of them took place after Kennedy forced Israel to accept regular visits in 1963. But these inspections were meaningless. Because Israel knew the schedule of the inspectors' visits, it was able to disguise the true purpose of the reactor. The inspectors eventually reported that their inspections were useless due to Israeli restrictions on what parts of the facility they could investigate. And behind the scenes, Israel was racing toward the bomb. By 1965, Israel had completed its super-secret underground separation plant. By 1966, it started to produce weapons-grade plutonium, and on the eve of the 1967 war, Israel assembled its first nuclear devices. By the time Kennedy died, Israel had already achieved critical nuclear milestones. The reactor went critical on December 26, 1963, just 1 month after Kennedy's assassination. Some historians believe Ben-Gurion deliberately timed his resignation to defuse Kennedy's pressure at a critical moment. Others argue health and domestic politics played larger roles. But the timing is striking. Kennedy's most forceful letter, drafted June 15th, was scheduled for delivery June 16th. Ben-Gurion resigned June 16th. The letter went to Eshkol instead, who stalled for 6 weeks. By the time negotiations resumed, the Dimona reactor was months away from going critical. Kennedy had 5 months left to live. Did Kennedy's confrontation with Israel over Dimona contribute to his assassination? Conspiracy theories have existed for decades suggesting Israeli involvement. The evidence doesn't support those theories. But the evidence absolutely supports that Israeli leaders viewed Kennedy as an existential threat to their nuclear program. Kennedy worried that Israel's nuclear program was a potentially serious proliferation risk and insisted that Israel permit periodic inspections to mitigate the danger. Kennedy's long-run objective was to broaden and institutionalize inspections of Dimona by the International Atomic Energy Agency. If Kennedy had succeeded, Israel would not have nuclear weapons today. The Middle East would be a different place. The nuclear non-proliferation regime would be stronger. India, Pakistan, potentially other nations might not have pursued nuclear weapons. But Kennedy didn't succeed. He pushed harder than any American president before or since. He wrote letters that were unprecedented in their directness and their threats. He made Dimona a test of the U.S.-Israel relationship, and Israel called his bluff, or rather, outlasted him. Kennedy served 136 days as president. The Dimona project was conceived in 1957. Construction began in 1958. By 1963, Israel had invested 6 years and massive resources. Ben-Gurion had made the nuclear program Israel's highest priority. He saw it as insurance against another Holocaust. He saw it as non-negotiable. And he was willing to risk the American alliance to achieve it. Kennedy was furious with Israel's ostensible nuclear weapons program, fearing that the Soviet Union could use it as leverage to maintain its influence in the Middle East. If Israel had nuclear weapons, Arab states would seek Soviet protection. The arms race would escalate. Regional stability would collapse. Kennedy understood the stakes. But he also understood political reality. U.S. pressure was such that reportedly every high-level meeting and communication between the U.S. and Israeli governments contained a demand for an inspection of Dimona. Kennedy even made concessions to gain Israeli cooperation. The U.S. would sell Israel Hawk anti-aircraft missiles after having refused to sell Israel any major weapon systems for years. In addition, the U.S. government agreed to the Israeli demand that the inspections would be carried out by an all-American team, which would schedule its visits weeks in advance rather than the IAEA. These concessions doomed the inspections. Scheduled visits gave Israel time to prepare. American-only teams meant no international oversight. Kennedy had traded away the mechanisms that would have made inspections effective. Why? Politics. The pro-Israel lobby in America was already powerful in 1963. Kennedy needed Jewish votes, he needed campaign contributions, he needed political support. He couldn't afford to completely sever the relationship with Israel. So Kennedy tried to thread the needle. Tough rhetoric, strong letters, demands for inspections, but ultimate willingness to compromise. Israel recognized the pattern and exploited it. What's remarkable isn't that Israel deceived Kennedy. What's remarkable is how thoroughly they did it. Before the arrival of any visiting U.S. team, Dimona personnel invested weeks of efforts to make the deception believable. That required not only the concealment of the underground separation plant, but also the camouflaging of other components at the Dimona site to provide a credible but false picture of the reactor and its use. This wasn't improvisation. This was systematic deception at the highest levels of government. Israeli leaders lied to American presidents. They lied to American scientists. They built fake facilities. They scheduled tours to hide construction. They manipulated inspection protocols. From the start, Israeli leaders conceived of the Dimona project as a secret within a secret. The first secret was the 1957 French-Israeli nuclear agreement that led to the creation of the nuclear complex. And then there was a deeper secret, the large 6-story underground reprocessing facility that would provide a capability to produce weapons-grade plutonium and remain concealed. France helped build Dimona. French President Charles de Gaulle had insisted Israel not develop nuclear bombs from the plutonium processing plant. Ben-Gurion assured de Gaulle the plant was for peaceful purposes. Another lie. De Gaulle eventually figured it out and cut off French support. But by then, Israel had what it needed. Kennedy knew he was being lied to. His intelligence agencies knew. His scientists suspected. But Kennedy couldn't prove it without genuine inspections, and Israel wouldn't allow genuine inspections. The result was a standoff that Kennedy ultimately lost, not because he died, although his death certainly helped Israel, but because the American political system wouldn't support a president willing to truly confront Israel. After Kennedy, no American president seriously challenged Israel's nuclear program. Johnson accepted the charade of inspections. Nixon, after lobbying by Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir, agreed to an ambiguous status for Israel's arsenal. Don't ask, don't tell. Reagan, both Bushes, Clinton, Obama, Trump, Biden, none of them demanded Israel sign the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. None of them demanded IAEA inspections. None of them threatened to cut aid over Dimona. The only American president who tried was Kennedy. And he failed. Today, Israel possesses an estimated 200 and 400 nuclear warheads, bombs, missiles, submarine-launched weapons, a nuclear arsenal rivaling Britain or France, all developed in secret, all developed in violation of Kennedy's explicit demands, all developed while receiving billions in American aid. The telegram was declassified in the 1990s, but was not widely available until last week when the National Security Archives, a project affiliated with George Washington University, posted it on its website. We know about Kennedy's confrontation with Israel now because documents have been declassified. The letters between Kennedy and Ben-Gurion, the reports from scientists, the CIA assessments, all now public record. What they reveal is a story of presidential power and its limits. Kennedy was the most powerful man in the world. He commanded armies. He controlled nuclear weapons. He could end human civilization with a phone call. But he couldn't stop one small country from building atomic bombs. The lesson isn't about Israel specifically. The lesson is about how determined nations acquire capabilities their protectors oppose. Pakistan did it with China's help. India did it despite American objections. North Korea did it despite everyone's opposition. Once a nation decides nuclear weapons are essential for survival, once leaders make that program their highest priority, once they're willing to lie and deceive and resist, stopping them becomes nearly impossible short of military action. And Kennedy wasn't willing to bomb Dimona. He wasn't willing to invade Israel. He wasn't even willing to cut off aid and risk the domestic political consequences. So Israel got its bombs, and the Middle East got a nuclear power that refuses to acknowledge its arsenal exists. On June 15, 1963, Kennedy wrote the strongest letter any American president had sent to Israel. 24 hours later, Ben-Gurion resigned. 160 days later, Kennedy was dead. 13 months later, the Dimona reactor went critical. 3 years later, Israel produced weapons-grade plutonium. 4 years later, Israel assembled nuclear weapons. The timeline speaks for itself. If this story made you reconsider what you thought you knew about American foreign policy and nuclear proliferation, do something simple but powerful. Hit that like button. Every like tells YouTube this history matters and should reach more people. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss our next investigation into forgotten chapters of history. Every day, we uncover stories buried in declassified documents and sealed archives, tales of power, deception, and the limits of presidential authority. True history. True power. And now, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. Are you in the US, Europe, Middle East, Asia? Our community spans the globe, and your voice keeps these conversations alive. Share your city, your country. Even share your thoughts on nuclear proliferation and presidential power. Let us know you're here, engaging with history that powerful people wanted buried. Thank you for watching, and thank you for helping ensure that uncomfortable truths aren't forgotten. Because history doesn't repeat, but it echoes, and only by understanding the past can we shape the future.